Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Student Insider Podcast, the podcast all about personal development and university advice.
In this episode, we dive into academic stories, which is a new concept that me and Alex have developed, where we're going to give insights into the kind of things that graduates get up to that's a bit scrappy, and really gives you an insight into exactly what university life is like outside of, all the pretty pictures that you see online. So in this episode, we dive into my story, which was effectively how I managed to cram nearly a whole year of content into about a month overall. So it's definitely would not recommend. It's not an episode that we would recommend that you follow in our footsteps. However, we think there's some great morals about productivity, mindset, and really how to perform at university. So definitely stick around and be sure to let us know what you think. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Student Insider Podcast. I am joined, of course, once again by Alexandro Theodoro. Hello, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing pretty good, thanks Luke. How are you doing?
Yes, not bad, not bad. So today we're going to be this is a new sort of concept that we're thinking about for episodes, like academic stories, which could potentially involve, future graduates or future students. I think that could be something we're looking into, of the most scrappiest, on the cusp graduate stories of students at university. I think that would be interesting. But yeah, I guess today we're going to just sort of hop straight in to one of my own stories. And I think that the title that we're debating at the minute is currently How to Get a First in 5 Days. So yeah. Yeah,
sounds good. Yeah, this is an idea you had from when you were finishing your degree, and I think it'd be interesting to talk about. And yeah, essentially seeing other people's stories about anything from stuff they've done on the side at uni or something related to the degree like this. But yeah, so yeah, Luke, let's hear a bit about, I guess, the story of this, maybe a bit about how before and what led up to it and during, and yeah, let's hear the awesome story.
Yeah, let's hop straight into it. So this goes back to when I was in my third year. This would have been around I want to say end of March, April time, when I was just finishing up my dissertation. So I guess for those who aren't too familiar with uni terminology, dissertation is effectively your third year project. It's the biggest part of your degree. I'm not sure if different programs are structured differently, but for the most part, I think majority of the time in your third year of university, there is a big project that you have to submit. So I was in the middle of doing that, and it was taking up a lot of my time. I was in the lab effectively 6 days a week, from early in the morning till the evening. And I guess on the side, looking after myself and seeing friends, keeping my mental health in good check. It was difficult to find time for anything else. So as I was reaching this deadline for my dissertation, it was all hands on. Sending feedback or sending my drafts to my supervisor to get feedback on my dissertation, and then doing the improvements basically on the spot. And this was a week before the deadline was due. But luckily I managed to get everything submitted on time. But unfortunately, as we sort of stemmed into the May period near the end of April, I realised that my first exam was 5 days from the time when I finished my dissertation and my presentation. So that didn't leave me with a lot of time, and unfortunately in my position, doing iGEM, which I've spoken about plenty on here, so definitely brush back to some old episodes to get the update on the iGEM situation. But it's effectively a big project that I did on the side of my university degree, which took up a lot of time and really distracted me from my studies in my third year, which is to the fault of my own. But at the same time, I found a lot more enjoyment in the project outside of my actual degree. I found that, going to the lectures and doing a lot of reading without having any purpose was something that really put me off, I think. And, I've got no one to blame but myself for that, I feel. So, yeah, a combination of those two factors put me in a position where I had only briefly looked at, minimal lectures for these exams that were coming up, and didn't have any notes on them. And the notes I did have would have been drawings that or notes that I'd written on my surface using a pen. So it wasn't necessarily notes that I could easily brush through to revise for these exams. And I guess what makes it even worse is that I hadn't had any essay practice at all. Hadn't gone to any of the workshops to prepare myself for these essays. So yeah, that's the position I was in, Alex.
So in terms of how many exams did you have, and So you had 5 days. Was it just one exam for, or was it multiple modules? Like, what was you facing up against?
Yeah, so I guess at the beginning of May, I was faced with, I think it was a total of 7 assessments over the May period.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was 5 days from when, my first exam was 5 days away, and the rest was spread out all the way until the end of May. Quite nice intervals, I would say. So that's what I was faced up against, with no revision, effectively. So I was in a very bad state, I would say.
So was you tackling one at a time then? So like, you had like those gaps in between, which is like, okay, this one's coming up in 5 days. Do I have to go full on this one? And then, okay, that's done. Now we have to do another one and then another one. Was that the approach, or was it planned out differently? How did you?
Yeah, so that was my plan at the end. I think that was the most strategic thing that I could have done in that situation. But I think to backtrack a little bit, just before that, I really was considering whether this was actually possible and if this was something that I could pull off, because it's the most important section of your degree. It's the most heavily weighted. So if this went wrong, then effectively 2 years of work would have meant nothing in a kind of pessimistic, depressing way of viewing things. So obviously, I'd lost a lot of motivation at that point, and I'd spoken to a lot of academics leading up to my exams, because I knew they were coming up, as like sort of in my immediate support circle, saying, this is my situation. What can I do? Like, is there anything I can do? And luckily, in my position, they said that given my circumstances, it was highly likely that I would have been able to defer them. So that was always like a cushion that I could fall back on in that scenario, which was nice. And I think if I didn't have that security, I wouldn't have just attempted it in the first place, because I guess that's where we start getting into the actual story, because the main turning point was, I do have this backup and I can defer, but do I want to? Is this, like, I kind of felt the challenge. I thought, like, even if it does go horribly wrong, I can still reset them. So it's worth the attempt in the first place, if that makes sense. So I think having that to fall back on made the process a lot easier to digest and actually easy to tackle, because I think that if it was all stakes on, I would have been a lot more stressed, and my performance probably would have dropped. I think I would imagine.
So if you deferred it, would it cap your mark though? Would it cap your mark if you like reset it?
I think I did find out eventually that it would have definitely had an impact on my overall mark. I'm not sure what the exact cap was, but I think it definitely would have been reduced, if I remember. So that, luckily, ignorance was bliss in that scenario, I guess, in a sense. that I didn't actually have that knowledge at the top of my head. But so yeah, I guess from that May periods onwards, with 5 days to go, it was really a matter of sitting down and strategizing and figuring out exactly how I'm going to pull this off. And I think the main thing is really figuring out exactly how much needs to be done in each period before each exam. So how many lectures are there? How much content do I need to get through? And then figuring out the best method of doing that. So what I ended up settling on is effectively looking through all the lecture slides, not even listening to the lectures. So they were all pre-recorded, luckily, because King's has a great system in place. I'm not sure if all unis have that. But that was my main resource, was looking at these lecture slides, looking at the objectives, pasting all the learning objectives for each lecture into my notes, and then basically making sure that I can read each learning objective, or each, whatever that module is specifically asking for, because a lot of the times you get like a module handbook. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
Yeah.
So basically pasting all the objectives that I need to learn for each module and saying, okay, can I competently answer this question? Am I confident in this? So, like, can I define, the process of some sort of immunological system? What would have been one of the objectives on my module? If it was a no, then it's like, okay, now I need to start looking into this. So that was my first step. And then, started looking into the lectures and looking at what kind of content I needed to learn. And basically the presentation slides acted as a foundation which then I started looking into the academic research papers. And there's a really good article, I'll post it into the show notes, which basically shows you how to speed read things. I know Tim Ferriss has a good technique for speed reading as well, but when you're reading academic papers, especially for science, a lot of the content in there isn't necessarily going to be helpful for your exams unless you're specifically answering questions about methods and methodologies for different experiments and things. And a lot of the time that's not the case. A lot of the time they're asking for your actual knowledge of a subject. So ideally you can read the abstract, read like a bit of the introduction. You can do Control F on different papers, find keywords, find bits of information you're looking for, and then effectively apply that to your notes. And then, to link back to the thing about the Cambridge article I was talking about, it basically says that if you want to speed read something, you can read the first and last paragraph of every chapter, or if you want to read something in more depth, you read the first and last sentence of every paragraph in every chapter instead of reading the entire chapter. Because I guess that way, I don't know if that sounds familiar to you, Alex, but
so for a lot of essays that I've done, you need to, because you've got to read a lot of journal articles. You've got to filter out what's good and what's bad, what's going to provide you useful information for your essay, and what's like just not relevant. So you look at the abstract, you look at the conclusion. What are the results? What have they found? Does that relate to what you're talking about? Can you discuss upon that, or is it just irrelevant? So then you move on to the next one, read the next one, because you don't want to say these things are 20-25 pages. You're not going to want to read the whole thing, because you can find it out through the first page, the first paragraph, and the last ones, if what that is relevant. And if it is, okay, then you can dive a bit deeper to find out some more specifics. Also, Control F, 100%. Like, I remember looking for stuff like, so okay, like, are you looking for or if you're looking for something specific about, I don't know, if I'm looking for something about social media marketing or leadership in the workplace, like if I'm looking for a key term or a key thing, like have a look, are they talking about that? Discuss that in after reading that bit at the start to see if it's relevant. 100% useful. So you had, like, say those 5 days or whatever, what was the day to day, what was the plan going into that, of like, okay, this is the schedule I'm going to follow to ensure that I've given myself enough time, or I've got this, going to try and like work in a certain routine or a certain amount of hours? Like, what was the approach for that to kind of ensure the success?
It's an interesting question, Alex. I'd say the most important part, I think, is that when you're going into something so intense, you really need to make sure that you're looking after yourself to a certain degree. You need to know your limits, and I think luckily for me, having pushed myself so hard in an academic sense, I was very used to the long working periods. It was something that I was comfortable with, which I think really helped facilitate the process, but it was very much 8-hour days, very strict 8-hour days of studying, like a normal 9 to 5 effectively. And I made sure I stuck to that and gave myself time to make sure, so I could unwind and get myself ready for the next day of studying. And because I know that a lot of people talk about cramming and before exams, and I guess the majority of the consensus is don't cram, it's not good, which is for the sole reason, if you don't give your body any time to consolidate the knowledge that's going in, you're just trying to shove it all in at once. And as you know, it's the same thing. I think it works similar with sports, in that you really need to give yourself that recovery time so that you can carry on and progress. I think that memory formation works very similar. I'm no neuroscientist, but I know that's how it works to a certain extent. So it was 8-hour days, and I guess it was roughly about 4 or 5 days between each exam. So I got quite fortunate in that sense, and so it was 8-hour days for I basically split up. If there was 5 days till my exam, I'd try and finish the content in 3 or 4, and then leave an extra day for consolidation, and then that would be 8-hour days. So breaking that apart, if a module had 20 lectures, which I don't know if that sounds about average for you, or maybe more or less per module.
It depends on the module, but and if it's like year long or semester, but
so, well, for me anyway, most of my modules were 20 lectures. So breaking down 20 lectures into, I managed to get through a lecture at a pace of about 2 or 3 hours, going through and learning all the content and consolidating it in 2 and 3 hours per lecture. So, that's about 3 lectures per day, and 3 and 4 days, that's only 12 lectures, 13 lectures. So obviously there's still 17 odd lectures that I'm missing out on. But luckily, for modules, the first 2 lectures are usually irrelevant, because it's either consolidation from the last year or an introduction to the module. And statistically speaking, when you're getting essay topics in your final exams, you're not going to get all the topics. Obviously, there's going to be like an essay selection of, I don't know how many, maybe 4 or 5, and you've got 20 lectures of content. So statistically speaking, you can cut out the modules that either have absolutely abysmal lecturers, really, just the content's really complex and it's hard to get your head around, it's going to take too long, or the slides are just a mess and you can't gather any information from it. That was my selection criteria. So looking through the lectures, I'd say, okay, now I can cut out maybe 4 or 5 lectures max per module. And then that cut me down to a pace where I could actually squeeze in the amount of lectures and actually make sure I was learning this content, giving a day of leeway for sickness, emergencies, for stuff to go wrong, for stuff to take longer than expected, and then they've got an extra 8 hours the following day, or maybe even an extra 16 hours if I leave myself a 2-day period to, if anything goes wrong and or for consolidation. So that was my strategy going in, and then I basically repeated that for every module. And I think that luckily there was like a compounding effect in a way, as when I'd gone through one lecture or when I finished one exam for one module, my brain was, first of all, it was like a relief, and I could remove all that from information from my brain for new stuff to come in. And also it was, my modules were interlinked, and that's a big part of essay writing is playing to your strengths and making sure that you've got comprehensive knowledge of loads of different modules so that you can link them together and then build like a more comprehensive picture. So I think we've spoken a bit about this before, actually. So in that way, my exam results were a lot better for my exams later on in the year compared to my first exams. So that was my strategy going in. You're welcome to put some input, Alex.
Yeah, that's you definitely got a point on the picking out what's relevant and what's irrelevant. Like, for example, there's some lectures that you can see, if you get the module information or the handbook or whatever, you can see, okay, that lecture is actually, there's not a requirement in there. So if you're in that point where you need to, like, you've got a really short amount of time and you're like running behind and you've got to pick out those crucial bits, you have to pick and choose sometimes to see what is that basic information that you need, and what is that extra stuff which would be nice to have, but because you just need to get past that finish line, maybe learning more of the basic stuff throughout all the topics mentioned, it will probably give you a better opportunity versus knowing a few of the topics really well, because then you're playing like you're gambling there on that end.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely
also agree. I would say, doing that, how did it feel once you finished? Once you've done that last exam and you were like, okay, you've been working solid for like maybe a month or whatever. How did it feel once you finished? Like you put the pen down or whatever. How did it feel once you finished and walked out that exam?
It was very, very. I won't say spooky is a good word. Spooky is a good word, I think, because luckily for me, I'd managed to keep myself in a state where I wasn't too stressed, and the exams didn't necessarily get to me, if that makes sense. Because I know that once you've gone through like a challenge and it's like, and you just feel like a weight off your shoulders. But luckily for me, I don't feel like I was carrying that much weight, honestly. I feel like it's very much a mindset thing, and it's something that you really do develop over uni, and something that I think that we're trying to push here with our podcast, and the message here is like building on that productivity and that mental resilience. Because I don't think I would have been able to do this if I hadn't had, the experience that I'd had doing project development and balancing uni and things. I think that that's fundamental life skills if you really want to succeed. So it wasn't too much of a surprise. It was more of just like a relief that I could get a bit of my life back, because, I do say like now that it was difficult to get through it. It's not like it was a very pleasant process. I made it sound very, very structured and very organized, which it was, but there was also a lot behind the scenes that you didn't get to see, which was me, being on my own a lot for 8 hours a day, not really doing no group study. It was always on my own. I didn't have time to invite other people to my study sessions, because that's lost time. If we get off track, it's like, even if it's like 15 minutes, that's still like a quarter of a lecture of content that I'm missing out on, So I didn't have time to do that. So it wasn't a very pretty situation. So it was very relieving that I could, start seeing my friends again. And I guess at the same time, it was very much like a flat line. And then it was a bit of like euphoria, knowing that I'd finished my whole degree. I think that kicked in eventually. But, I think the nicest part was just knowing that the exams did go well. I think that you can always tell if an exam's gone well. And over the years, after doing so many exams, I think it's very easy to predict roughly percentage-wise how you've done on exams from how the quality of the essays that you've written. Because a good habit to get into is always reading what you've written after your essays. And once you read through it and you sit there and you think, this is what I'm submitting, is this something that I'm happy submitting, and is it going to do well? And the majority of the time you can answer that for yourself, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you get into your final year, you have an understand of the uni and what they're looking for, and like what makes a good essay, what makes a bad essay, and etc. If if you could, because you were focusing on iGEM, if you could go back, would you have started earlier, or would have you left it focusing on iGEM and then just doing what you did and how you done it? Like, which way would you prefer?
I would say that, and I put iGEM at the forefront because I definitely think it was a big factor, but it wasn't an excuse, if that makes sense. I think that obviously I was very busy in the September period, and especially, but when sort of going into the new year, it was very much like it was more of like a mental recovery from iGEM, because it was more stressful than my exams, 100%. It was a very demanding process, and I think historically at King's, iGEM has been a very demanding process for students. So I don't blame myself in that sense, but I also don't feel like, as I said, don't want to make excuses, because, there's still a lot of bad habits that I had back then, like very anti-productive habits. Like we've spoken before about social media and video games was a big one, and they still had deep roots in my life. So that was definitely a big factor towards it. So I think that it was definitely, but you can always balance it. It's just about how you shift your mindset, how you manage the stress, how you manage the work, and what you're comfortable doing at the end of the day. So it's a big. I don't know how to answer that in a very clear way, but it really depends on the individual, I think.
Would you recommend it to others or not? to try and cram like that?
No, I would say probably so.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I would very much just. I think it's just interesting to know it's possible, but it shouldn't be used as an excuse. 100%. The main drawback, I think, from me is, I've got like a whole list of points here of reasons why I would not recommend it, actually. And we've already said one of them was that I went off the radar for literally 30 days. Whilst I was doing these exams, and I think the worst part of it is that it's very the content that I did cram in, because it was essentially cramming. It was structured cramming, if anything. Like, that's how I'm going to define it. Maybe that's the Bateman study technique, structured cramming. Could be a new way. We'll see. We'll get a research study done on that. That could be interesting. But I think the worst thing is that I can only put together bits and pieces of the content. So if someone was to ask me about my third year and what I studied, it would be very, very hard for me to give in-depth knowledge on topics, because it was very rushed, very broad. We're talking 3 hours on a topic. So if someone asked me anything, it's difficult. But it gets you the result, but it doesn't give you the knowledge, if that makes sense. I don't think that I can recall much from my third year at all. Really, only the coursework really sticks in, but that's because I spent more time on it. So,
I guess that becomes, because you had iGEM. It's like you have and your degree. It's like you've got that balance of practical and academic in theory, which is an interesting combo, because you kind of see that you gravitated more to the practical stuff, which makes a lot more sense because you're actually doing something more than just learning about something. Yeah, a big thing at the minute is, and something that I've realised, because I'm sort of into that career space right now, and I've been on, speaking with a lot of recruiters and things, and having a degree just isn't enough. And I know that we've said this so many times, and it's kind of disappointing because you put so much hard work into a degree, but if you're not doing like a part-time work, or you're not developing something on the side, you have no side hustles on the side of uni, like, you really should start looking to do it, because and it's easy to say I don't have time, and I think that me and Alex, we can probably say this as well. When you're saying to yourself you don't have time, but then you think back to your first year and you're like, oh my god, I did have time, and I don't know why I didn't do more. If that makes sense, that's definitely something that I suffer with, and something that I would really recommend is I'll put a link to it, because it was very much a turning point for me, and it was a self-awareness article by Mark Manson, and it really makes you realize where your time's going. And a lot of the time that is into unproductive, like, I want to say, like, coping mechanisms. Unproductive coping mechanisms. It's like, especially like social media is a big one. Like video games for me. Like, I love video games, but you need to make sure you're doing it in a productive way, because a lot of the times it's not, unfortunately. So I would highly recommend, just always having something on the side at university. You should always see university as like the foundation, and then you really need to start putting in the effort to build on that foundation, to get yourself out there, to make yourself stand out when you're applying to jobs, because otherwise people are going to see you've got a degree and just be like, great, but
why? Where's your work experience for this company?
Yeah.
What did you do?
Exactly. Yeah, I remember I was at this talk once, and they were like, "Oh, you're doing a degree in whatever. Oh, what did you create?" Or, I think it was film. It was like, "Oh, what did you create?" I was like, "Oh, I done this project for one of my modules," and they were like, "Okay, but what else did you do?" And they were like, "Not much." And they were just like, "Well, these companies, whatever, they care about what have you done outside, what have you done,
100%.
what else have you created in your free time, why would I take you on if you've not created any initiative or put some effort into showing a genuine interest, not just because you kind of chose to do this thing and you kind of have to do it in a way." Interesting to think about.
Yeah. I think just a tough part of the sort of the working environment in general is that a lot of the times you're going to just be desperate for work as a graduate, and you're going to see all these companies and they're going to want all this. They're going to want you to be like so dedicated. You're going to know like the history of the company. You've got to know what they're up to, and a lot of the times that's not really possible. So it's always nice to make sure that you do have that experience, so that you can stand out, and then you have a bit of a buffer in that sense, that you're going to have more success in interviews and waste less time filling out cover letters for companies that you don't necessarily care about. If that makes sense. So it's always good to set yourself up for the future, and I think you should always keep that in the back of your mind, keeping that long term in the back of your mind, because I think that you'll always regret not doing enough once you're out of a situation. But so it's always worth getting yourself out there, I'd say. But I think it'll be nice to just maybe summarize. I don't know if you have any other questions, Alex, but
no, I think that's mostly it. I think this so it's a bit of a shorter episode than usual, but a bit interesting to do a academic story.
Yeah, I was just going to say I've written down a couple of like takeaway messages that I took from this experience, and I think that the main thing is really developing that like academic study motivation productivity mindset, I guess I want to call it. What do we call that? We'll have to get like an acronym and just call it like the AM productivity it's a mindset, and really just getting yourself adapted and ready for the most challenging of tasks, because it is competitive these days. So you really do need to put that work in, and it's going to feel impossible sometimes, but it is so possible. It's just you just have to keep pushing yourself. There's a good company called Seek Discomfort that you could look into. I haven't looked into them much, but I thought that their title, I guess, was pretty inspiring.
Is that Yes Theory, right?
Yes, I think so. Yes Theory, something like that.
Yeah.
So I would, 100%. Read. Me and Alex have got. If you go onto our link tree, we'll put the link to that in the show notes. We have a book recommendations that we highly recommend to read, and a lot of them are based around Stoic principles. Which, honestly, Stoicism is the study. I'm going to say it's the study mindset. I think it is the best thing. It makes stress bearable, and it keeps you motivated, I think, as well. So 100%. Another thing is having a good study playlist. I think is a big one. Keep it spiced up. Keep something to listen to.
Oh yeah.
Keep it. I think I cycled probably for about 20 different playlists. I won't list them all, but
wow. If
anyone wants to listen to my study playlists, I'll link all the YouTube links in the show notes. I'll do that as a dedication to the viewers. That's something I can. That could be funny, actually. I'll see what people think about my playlists. Another big thing is making sure that you have places to vent and support from others, because there was times when I did get overstressed. I'm like, oh my god, I'm not prepared for this exam. But luckily, I had like amazing flatmates and amazing friends to make sure I got through that process. So, I think there is, even though this was an extreme scenario, I think it applies to a more generic scenario too. And another thing is a consistent schedule. I'm sure you can agree with this, Alec. I think consistency is the key. I think Brianna Wiest in her book 101 Essays speaks about this as well, and it basically goes as far as to saying that consistency is the key to happiness. I think we've mentioned this one here a couple of times, but yeah, having a consistent schedule is definitely something to consider. 2-hour structures was my technique, and Alex has gone on about time blocking as well, and other bits and pieces in the past. But I think if you listened to me a few episodes ago, I said I was an advocate of chaos, but now I'm an advocate of consistency. So I have changed my mindset, guys.
Bit of a change.
Big change. I'm an advocate of inconsistent consistency. Inconsistent. No, this is going to get confusing, but being consistent with
Where's
things,
the consistency?
but you can be inconsistent with some things.
Yeah.
Like, you know, don't always. We can't always attend the meetings. We can't always do everything we want to do in the week. But as long as you've got some sort of consistency and you are hitting those objectives, I think that's the key, really.
It's like long term consistency. Like if you're consistent 90% of the time, that's what matters. You know, like those 10%. It's alright to have, you know, those bits that you miss out or whatever. But if you're consistent over the long term, then I think that is what matters. Yeah,
and I guess a caveat as well, a big caveat now I think about it, is that my exams were online. So that's a big thing. That's a very important part. We probably should mention that a bit sooner. Yeah, obviously because of COVID and the adjustment, the uni were kind enough to give us online exams. They were timed, but obviously we had access to all our notes. So this cram was more so of me cramming down notes rather than cramming things into my mind, which is probably correlates quite well to why I can't remember things very well. So yeah, do keep that in mind. I think that if this was an in-person scenario, I did have one in-person exam, which was my Japanese exam, but luckily it was a class I really enjoyed, and it was my only class that was in person. So I was obligated to attend it. So the knowledge went in because I was consistent with it. There you go, consistency again.
There you go.
So that was the one exam that wasn't virtual, but I ended up smashing that one anyway, luckily. So yeah. I think that's a summary of my story. Yeah. So, but this is not an advocacy. This is more of a. There's a moral to take from this story.
More for just sharing the journey.
Yeah, there's a moral to take.
More just sharing the journey. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot. I've learned.
Don't try and avoid.
100%. Yeah, I've learned a lot. So, but yeah, interesting, lovely. Yeah. So I guess thank you very much, guys, for listening. We hope to see you in the next episode. Be sure to follow us on all the socials.
Yeah, thanks a lot for listening, everyone. Follow up. We'll link all the socials below, all the podcast platforms. If you're listening on one of our podcast platforms, I can speak. We are on YouTube as well, but if you're watching on YouTube, we are also on podcast platforms. Feel free to check them out. Everything will be linked down below in the description / show notes. We hope that you enjoyed it. Also, please feel free to rate, review on any of your favourite podcast platform. And yeah, we will see you in the next one.
Yeah, see you in the next one, guys.